Today on the Grid Snaps podcast, Death Stranding Spoiler Edition. And welcome to the Grid Snaps podcast, everyone. Rob Howard back with guest Chris Millar to discuss more Death Stranding, but this time we are going to go deep into the spoilers. The previous one was the no spoilers, with the exception of gameplay stuff. There are some people that think any detail at all about a game is going to be a spoiler, and we talked about like, hey, you have items that do certain things, but I don't really consider that a spoiler. This podcast, though, just to warn you, we are going deep into the story. We're going to talk about the plot. We're going to talk about what happens in the game. So if not everyone cares about it. Some people just don't care about spoilers. Doesn't affect their experience. Others want to be surprised. If that is you, sorry, you should probably not listen to this. But before we get into that, just how's it going, Chris? What have you been playing lately? Just how are things?
Well, I've been playing Death Stranding.
That's right.
I think it was just this past Sunday, I got 100% trophies on it. So I was putting a lot of time into it over the weekend.
And, I probably played the most, because I'm not a completionist gamer. Shame on me, I know, right? So what happens with games when I play them is I'll beat them. I do like to complete games, like beat them in terms of like the story or campaign. But once, we got into this world of trophies and achievements and New Game Plus and all of that really got going. And if you listen to our last podcast, you might remember that apparently Chrono Trigger is one of the first games to do a New Game Plus, just as an aside. Thanks to our guest Jason Gaylor for dropping that knowledge. Once we got into that realm where there was just like extra content, I kind of just crapped out on that stuff. I was just thinking, I did the job, I beat the game, right? But with Death Stranding, I actually did a considerable amount of post-game playing, nowhere near as much as you've done. But if you look at my trophy list on my PS4 account, it's pretty pathetic and sad. Like, even games I've beaten, I haven't gotten that many of the trophies.
Oh, and I'm the same way as you, actually, except for two games, Metal Gear Solid 5 and Death Stranding. Those are the only two I've ever even attempted to go trophy hunting, and I've got 100%. Otherwise, yeah, I'm the same way. All my PS4, Xbox games, etc. It's as long as I've beaten the game. If I played it at all, even, I have a stack a mile high of games I haven't even played.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if Chris Millar is not on Hideo Kojima's Christmas fruit basket list, he really should be. But yeah, man, I played a good bit. I think I'm actually at 65% of the way through the trophies, which is like really good for me. And I didn't really I didn't play much this week, but that has much more to do with the fact that the new Purdue semester is coming like a freight train, and I was scrambling to get ready more than anything else. The game actually plays really well in its post game content. There's something about 5-starring those locations that in building zipline networks to be able to do it efficiently. It's kind of a different game, and a compelling game at that, I would say.
I would agree, yes.
And I know that we'll probably mention this a little later in the show what these actually are, but you've had some even interesting surprises, I think, that have happened like deep into the post game, which is always really impressive when the game manages to surprise you somehow.
Oh yes, it's one I'm thinking in particular that gave me the chills.
And I tell you what, when we get to that point, I might actually take my headphones off and let you explain it, and then put my headphones on, so I'm not spoiling myself.
No, I don't think I want to spoil this one for anyone unless you want me to.
Okay, maybe that will still be a secret, which is I think totally appropriate.
Because I don't want to even risk spoiling it for you. So.
Oh, that's very touching, Chris. I appreciate that. But I have been playing some other stuff, mainly because I got my Christmas gifts. Santa was nice to me, even though, little secret here, Santa at age 39 is just me buying things for myself that I wrap for myself. It's sad.
Same for me at age 42. So
It's a sad life, you know, because what ends up happening, by the way, why would someone wrap a gift for themselves? It's as pathetic as it sounds, first of all, but it's because, like, it's really because of boredom. I'll sit there on Christmas morning and, like, and the kids are opening all their things, and there might be, like, an item or two from whomever, but, like, you know, usually adults don't give each other gifts, you know, that
yes.
there's kind of you age out of that, and so you're just
Correct.
sitting there bored while the kids are, like, especially, I don't know how your family does Christmas, but mine does it like the youngest starts first, you know, then the next youngest, and everyone kind of goes one at a time. And
Right.
I'll be super pissed off if we ever, you know, that's just how you do it. You know, that's almost at a level of religious belief for me. Like, that is how you do Christmas package opening. But because of that, if I don't have enough gifts to open for myself, I'm just twiddling my thumbs while it's, like, you know, the children going, and that's annoying. So I'm like, yeah, you know, I'm gonna just wrap some stuff up so that I have something to open, and you know. Just so I can get that, to put it in Death Stranding terms, that oxytocin hit.
Right. Yes, of course.
Right. But yeah, I picked up Shenmue 1 and 2 PS4, the PS4 kind of re-release. And, you know, I won't go too deep into it because we're actually going to do a podcast about it later. But Shenmue is a very flawed game, but a very fascinating one that's been somehow, really, despite the odds, holding my attention. Although I will admit, like, doing a podcast about it does kind of make me want to persevere, maybe in a way that, yeah, I wouldn't otherwise. But it's not completely without merit. I'm certainly glad I have it. It's like $20, so I mean,
Right.
to get 2 games in one package, you know, up-resed, looks pretty good. Actually, it's got, like, okay options. It's not a soup to nuts remake like Capcom's been doing, but it is a nice remaster. I've been playing the Phoenix Wright series again, which I'm not sure if, actually, we have not on this podcast talked about it very much. It's actually one of my favorite game series, but I stopped playing it after the first trilogy of games, just because sometimes, and I experienced this, Chris, with the Uncharted games, I think, like, you play a couple of them, and then you think, well, you know, I like it, but I know what I'm going to get, so I'll kind of play other things that I don't know what I'm going to get. Which,
Right.
you know, gets harder and harder as games kind of become the same more and more. But you know, I let, you know, there's been so many, and I was just like, I pulled my 3DS back out of mothballs, and it was on sale. The one called Apollo Justice, which is the first game I hadn't played in the series. It came out after the original trilogy. I've been playing that because I can just play that almost like my nighttime reading. I'll go into bed, grab my 3DS. It's a you know, visual novel type game anyway, so it is almost like that. And they're super fun. It kind of reminded me of, like, why I like the original games. Well written characters, really sharp, funny localizations, hilarious animations. You know, Capcom does a really nice job on those.
No, I've never played one before. Is it like Snatcher?
It is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it is, actually. Now that you mention it, I hadn't really thought about that too hard. Now,
You said visual novels. I was like, the
right.
only kind of game I played like that is Snatcher. So
Yeah, it's based on this idea of, you know, it simulates being a defense attorney. Like, the name of the first game was Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney.
Right.
And, you know, this series I'm on now is Apollo Justice, Ace Attorney. It's like the next lawyer character, right? And kind of how it works is that you go and you kind of collect evidence at the crime scene. And yeah, I'm actually, the more I think about it, there is a lot of similarities to Snatcher, because, like, you go through these static screens and you kind of click around. There isn't necessarily well, you do have an assistant character that I guess would be filling the Metal Gear's role.
Right.
And then once you collect enough stuff, then, and I think this is what kind of differentiates it from Snatcher, you go into court, and you actually have to then defend your client in court. And the way they set it up is clever. It's like every witness you cross-examine, it's like a battle. And you have a life bar, and if you make objections that are wrong, like, and that's like, just like in court, you know, objection, you know, Your Honor, and all that, you do that, but that's like an attack, basically. And if you don't have a good objection, then the judge removes some of your life bar, and if the life bar goes all the way down, then your client's found guilty, and the trial ends and you lose.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's pretty fascinating set of games, and like it's sort of it's not as like I tried playing the Jake Hunter games, which is another kind of brand of visual novel games, and those are very like, yes, you are just playing through a story. There's like really very little attempt to kind of bake in gameplay. It's just like, you're talking to people, you're clicking on the screen, that's what you do. And the really good the games in the visual, sort of novel genre that I like, and Snatcher does this too, is they bake in some gameplay just
Right.
enough to engage you. Like Snatcher does that with the shooting
Mm-hmm.
scenes and everything. So, well, cool. I think we've gotten through all the good preliminary stuff. Last warning for our audience: we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back from the break, and then we're jumping into heavy duty spoilers. So if you've listened up to this point and you don't want to be spoiled, turn it off now. So we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to dig deep into Death Stranding. All right, welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with Chris Millar, and it is spoiler time. It is time to really dig into the game completely, and how we're going to do this is I've broken this up into sections. So let's just start talking about the world of the game, the environment of the game, and for me, just to get started, like there's such a sense of beautiful desolation, in that environment. It is supposed to be America, but because of the Death Stranding event, it doesn't really look at all like America like we know. In fact, most people say it looks like Iceland, I guess. I haven't been to Iceland, so I have no idea if that's true. It does kind of also look like the Scottish Highlands, maybe, which I haven't been there either, but I've seen pictures and so forth. It's a very uncanny valley, America. It's an America that kind of looks like it could be America, but it's not any kind of geography that you recognize. Like, Chris, what did you think of the environment when you first started exploring it?
Well, it was so well done. I actually felt you can almost feel the wetness of it or the moistness,
Yes,
if you
yes.
know what I mean. Like it just like where I grew up it was a very humid, moist area, and I felt like I was back in that area where I
Okay.
grew up. And it was complemented by obviously all the rain and everything and the vegetation, but also the things that were rusting.
Right, right.
So it felt very damp. And even though you're only seeing it, you're not smelling it or anything like that. It was that well done that it felt damp to me. So I thought that it was really well done that way.
Yeah, there was a note I made in this section of our notes that you talking about the rain reminds me of, and that's the snow areas later on in the game. There's just something about the way the weather is handled in this game that creates this. And like I work at a college now, so maybe someone at Purdue actually knows what if there's an actual academic term for this, but there's this effect where you are controlling a player avatar through inclement weather, whether it's the rain, which I hadn't thought about till you mentioned it, and I realized, yes, it's absolutely the same feeling, where it's so realistically portrayed that even you sitting in your comfortable living room, you actually feel like the player character does a tiny bit. Like when it's raining all the time, you actually feel more moist, and certainly when you're going through that snow, I shivered. I got colder
Yeah,
in my seat. I
absolutely.
clutched my blanket tighter. The weather in this game is amazing in its
Yes.
atmosphere. Its
Yes.
atmospheric effects.
I had so this game came out in November, and I'm in Canada, right? So it's snowing at this time. And I had a shovel that was sitting outside. And for a moment, I had a moment of panic that I had to get the shovel in the house because it was going to rust from the
That's
snow.
great. Yes, yes,
And then
yes.
suddenly I'm like, wow, this is a pretty good game if it's got my brain thinking that for even a second. that snow was going to rust my shovel. So yeah.
And I guess that segues into the Timefall reign itself to kind of get into the first somewhat spoilery thing. Actually, is the way Timefall is introduced in the game. I mean, just looking back on all the cutscenes again, because we both you binged the game completely. I played it as fast as my life allows me to play a game.
Yes.
Right? It's not very fast, but still, for me to get through a game, to start it in November and to get through the game by mid-December is pretty good for me.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good, a game of this length anyway. But yeah, like you get introduced to Timefall right away. I mean, there's that opening scene where Norman Reedus, as Sam Porter Bridges, is on his motorcycle, and he allows a drop of the Timefall to hit his head, and it turns that tiny part of his hair gray. And then he puts his hood up, and so really quickly you get a kind of amazingly complicated thing explained very simply, which is actually quite impressive when you think of like Timefall as as a mechanic, how kind of unintuitive that is, and how really easily they explain that in that opening cutscene. That the water hits stuff, makes stuff get older, right? So that was quite well done, because this is a pretty heavy duty game in terms of like the concepts it's trying to use. So whenever they can just very easily visually explain something like that, it's just like a huge win for them, I think.
Absolutely.
I do notice a cheat, though, they do, and I'm okay with it, but it is a little bit of a cheat. A hood is not going to prevent that rain from hitting your face, right? It's just, it's just not going to prevent. You're going to get a little bit splashed with the Timefall, but, I think the decision there had to have been, look, we have Norman freaking Reedus. We can't have him in a full mask.
Yeah.
Like we can have Higgs in a mask because, as well known as Troy Baker is in the gaming community, Troy Baker doesn't sell games on his own like Norman Reedus would, so he can be in a mask, right?
Yes.
But we're not putting Norman Reedus in a full mask. So
and that's totally true, because I mean, when you go down a zip line in the winter, I mean, you can even see the snow on Sam's face, like it's collecting on his mustache, but he's not aging. So
right, yes, and the snow is also Timefall, obviously, for people that don't know that. Yep, and
in fact, those snowy areas are where my zip lines deteriorate the most quickly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't because I haven't played as much as you, I haven't had that panic of, oh, my awesome zipline network is deteriorated. It's still holding firm, but I'm not looking forward to having to lug chiral crystals around just to repair my network.
Which is, I've had to do that. I've had to go, and it is a bit of anxiety creating when you've built this network, and then you don't know, like when the game warns you that this thing near the Mountaineer is degrading, you don't know if it's yours or if it's an online zip line, right? So I've had to farm for crystals just to get them up there to keep my network going.
And the thing about the Timefall also, and I think this is true of a lot of things in this game, and actually true of Kojima's work just in general, is, okay, if you sit there and you try to like logically puzzle it out in every way you can, it's going to fall short somewhere, right? I think someone online, you may have mentioned this, or maybe Patrick did, or someone else did. It's like, okay, if like, I remember someone had mentioned like, okay, so if Timefall is causing the plants to like grow and die, and it does show that, like, why aren't the habitations, the bridges, distribution centers and so forth, like covered in basically dirt from all the built up dead plants that kind of build up, they sit there, build up. It would like greatly accelerate a lot of natural processes. So why wouldn't it just build up? And here's the thing, like, I could think real hard and try to defend that, but I actually don't think it matters. I think Kojima does this sort of thing on purpose. I think he said this, if I recall, or people that have worked with him maybe have said this, that he doesn't mind some things being mysterious. And I think that's okay. Otherwise, I mean, you would have to bore the player with like, and he does a lot. I mean, there's a lot of explanations in this game. I mean,
Yes.
there's, so it's not like he's not trying. This is not like a Marvel movie, right? Where a Marvel movie, like Iron Man figures out something amazing and all these things happen and it's just waved off as superhero magic. And in those movies, nothing's explained. I guess it's a happy medium between like, if you take like Christopher Nolan's movies where it's like everything must be explained and everything must have like, the bat suit was a military suit invented for soldiers, but it didn't work out, and this is just a one-off suit, and now Bruce Wayne takes, that's what he does, right? Everything's got to be laid out, perfectly, and then, the Marvel movies are kind of the opposite end, where, like, no one cares, like, to the point where it actually really annoys me most of the time, actually, like, there's no effort. I think Kojima sits in the middle of that in a nice way, I think, because like there's certainly plenty of explanation of Timefall, but even the characters in universe will admit we don't fully understand it. We just don't. And so, why isn't there like tons of dirt being made from all these planets? I don't know, and I think it's okay. It just does not bother me at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, another thing with the world that I wanted to bring up before we kind of move on, or if you had any other thoughts about the game world, of course, is, sort of the influence of walking. I think this is actually really a vital piece here because you have a lot of, and we complained about it in our first podcast, and it's a legitimate complaint. Vehicles don't work great. You cannot get in a vehicle and go from, Capital Knot City to Edge Knot City, or at least to the lake. Right, I don't even think you can do that. Take like a vehicle from Capital Knot all the way to Lake Knot or whatever.
You can once you build the highway, but that's not an easy feat.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
I guess that's a good point. There is, much later you can do it that way. But in terms of like just I guess in someone's standard playthrough, you really can't because you're going to run into unfriendly terrain and you're going to be forced to walk. And I think that was an intentional decision because here's the thing. Like we've talked about this on Facebook constantly, like this notion of like, oh, Death Stranding, this had to have been like a $400 million game, like Grand Theft Auto 5, whatever Grand Theft Auto 5 was. Sure it was, if it wasn't 400 million, it was a lot. And so, but here's the thing, Death Stranding is, I'm almost positive, I don't have numbers, I don't know, but like just my own experience as a game developer, puzzling these things out, I don't think it was a $400 million or even a $100 million game. I think it was a AAA game, but if one can call a AAA game reasonably priced, I actually think it is. And you can tell because there are fascinating kind of scope-reducing decisions. And you look at the size of that world, it seems massive. It does seem like a huge world, but once you build the zip lines, once you build the highway, is it that big anymore? Not really. You can get around that world pretty fast when you build that stuff. And that's a neat little trick they did. Focusing on walking greatly expands because, you're supposed to be walking across the entire continent of America, right? And they probably give you the actual landmass of probably a couple of Rhode Islands or something. It's always tricky in games to figure out how big a landmass is because player characters never move at real speeds. They always move much faster, and so it's tricky. But like it is not even remotely close, obviously, to an actual continental America. But it feels it doesn't feel small. It doesn't feel even fake. You buy it, I think. And the walking's a huge part of that because when you're carrying all that crap and you're walking and trudging along, how do you put it? The stumbler? You have a name for that?
Dispatch stumbler.
Yes, dispatch stumbler. When you're dispatch stumbling, there's my cat. Hello, Zelda. Welcome to the podcast. The dispatch stumbler, thing that you do, actually just makes the world seem bigger, which I think is a neat trick. There's a bunch of little neat tricks like that they do to kind of create the illusion of a much larger, big world, that kind of keeps things reined in. So I don't know. I've been yapping for a while, Chris. Do you have any more thoughts, just specifically on the game world?
Well, I think it's really interesting that if a BT I don't know what the term is. If it eats you, you know how if it starts shining gold and then it gobbles you and kills you,
Right, right.
it actually changes the landscape of the world permanently. It creates that, I guess, is it a void out? Like it
Yes.
creates that hole in the world, and it's permanent.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because I realized in all my preparations for this, I didn't forget about void outs, but I forgot about that aspect, the
Mm-hmm.
permanence of them. And yes, that is really cool. Now, here's the funny thing: I played super careful, super conservatively, and so I actually never had a void out happen. In fact, I think the first death I had in the game, other than the ones that happen because the story makes it happen, like you obviously have
You
the
fell
void
off a
out.
cliff.
I didn't fall off a cliff.
Oh,
It was the actually no, you're right. I actually did have one. I'm trying to think what my first death was. My first death was and I've seen other people online do this, so this must be very common. It's the mission where you have the antimatter bomb. I drove it into one of those
yes,
crevices and I got
yes, yes,
stuck.
yes.
And then like what
I
ends up
died there too. Yeah,
yeah, the truck falls down eventually. The truck gets stuck in the crevice, but then it this eventually kind of falls down, and that triggers the explosion
yeah, yeah.
because the bomb was in the truck. So that was my first death. That was well into the game, and then my second death was getting from the tar lake to Edge Knot because it took me a little while to figure out because I'd played so conservatively. They actually have this mechanic where it's like. The BTs grab you, and you think that that's it, and you have to do everything in your power to get them off of you, right? But in reality, and I didn't realize this because I was playing so carefully that I never let it happen, that the BTs will drag you to a boss fight. That's what happens.
Yes.
And I had avoided that entirely up until that point in the
Ah,
game.
okay.
And so when I get to the Tar Lake, and for those of you that are allowing yourself to be spoiled that don't know what we're talking about, the Tar Lake is this huge, massive lake of tar that you have to get across to get to the final area of the game. And what ends up happening is you get there, and there's no bridge, there's no way to get across. But then you're reminded that, hey, remember when you had that boss fight and buildings and objects started appearing out of the tar? How can you get that to happen again? Right? And they basically just leave it up to you. And the game assumes that you've had that happen at least once or twice. And I hadn't had that happen because I was so dang careful. So it took
Right.
me a while. And I actually died, I think, by suffocation, I think.
Hmm.
Because when you like I think there's like areas where if you go into the tar and you can suffocate in the tar and not have like the BTs drag you, and then all that happens, you just go into the seam and you go back into your body, and it all is well, right? But yeah, I mean but what I learned later, and I'm glad again you brought this up, is that if you go into one of those boss fights and you fail, then there is a void out and there's a permanent crater in the world. And that also happens with enemies, right? Like with mules, if you leave them to necrotize, will
Yes.
they not also potentially void out?
Well, not. I mean, when a boss does a void out, it creates a crater, and you go back to your business. But that's permanent on the landscape. But
Right,
if you kill a mule and you don't get him to the incinerator, and they give you lots of time to do it,
right,
by the
right.
way. But if you don't do it in time, it suddenly you get a message saying, I think it's from Die Hardman saying, "What have you done?" And the game is over, and then you have to go back to your last save. So
Okay. So that triggers a game ending void out.
complete game ending. Yeah.
Right, right. But I'm so glad you brought that up because there's a really cool persistence in the environment, and they're smart about it. Like there's a reason why the BTs grab you and then drag you to another location. It's the location that they have set up specifically to do that, right? Like so
Correct.
they set aside certain areas. It can't just happen anywhere, but it's a cool illusionary feeling that these
It is.
void outs
I
could.
call them haunted areas.
Right, right. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because even if you defeat one and you leave the scene briefly and you go back, there'll be a BT waiting for you. So
Okay.
they say it's rain patterns and all that, but really those places are permanently haunted. So
Right, right. Yes, that makes sense. All right, well, I think this would be a great time to take our second break because we're starting to get more and more into like the story and character elements just by virtue of talking about the environment. So let's take a little break, and when we come back, the story and characters of Death Stranding. Welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with Chris Millar talking Death Stranding, just spoiling away. And so let's get into the individual characters of the game and kind of their arcs and kind of what makes them interesting. Probably everyone has their favorites, but let's just start with kind of the star of the game. And I'm not talking about Norman Reedus. He's a star of the game, but really the true star of the game is Bibi, the baby. Never before, I think, in video game history has a baby been the star of a game in this fashion. I the only thing I can think of, Chris, that is even a tiny bit like this is I think in Fallout 4, in the tutorial section where they're teaching you the game mechanics, you play as a baby inside of the Fallout shelter, and that's it. You just become an adult or whatever. So this character immediately, first of all, it puzzled everyone. Why would you make a game with a baby attached to you and all this and that? But BB becomes a really important character. So, like, Chris, I guess before I give my take on it, like, did BB annoy you at first of all those cries? Did you bond with BB? You recently yourself are sort of a new father. Did that kind of make you even more receptive to the character?
It did, absolutely. Being a new father, very much more receptive than I think I would have been hadn't I been a father. I guess for all the crying in the game, and I thought there was way too much of it, they overdid that.
Yes.
When it was time to take BB to the incinerator, that really tugged at my heartstrings. That I was like, wow, we're really going to do this? Like, I really thought that was going to happen. And that made me really, like, I really grew to care about BB over time. And that really tugged at me when, and there's all this other crying over stuff. And I'm just rolling my eyes, like thinking, Star Trek Discovery thinks you people cry too much, So, I bonded with BB for sure.
Yeah, me too. And I agree at first. It's like, because they do the gimmick where he's crying, and I say he, but in a little bit, we'll go into that part of it. But where BB is crying through the controller and it's this, sort of canned sound effect of baby crying, and you're just like, you just get sick of hearing it. I've had to deal with this in my own life. I mean, obviously my children are now older. I have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, so I haven't had to deal with a baby in a few years. But
yes.
But just like it kind of mirrors Sam's character, and I think that's for a reason, which we'll get into when we talk about Sam specifically. Over time, BB's your buddy. BB is the character you experience the game with. It's not even like, because I'm tempted to think of it as like a evolution of escort mission type games like Resident Evil 4 if Ashley Graham and if I'm remembering that name right, I think that was her name.
Yeah.
And even BioShock Infinite, which I worked on with Elizabeth, a lot of, let me just tell you, as a game developer that worked on a game with a companion character, lots of work goes into that, like making those characters, sympathetic and not annoying and everything. But BB is more than an escort character. BB is part of you, really. I mean, literally connects to you, helps you. Like, that's your way you detect BTs. And of course, just to explain, I think it's fascinating. It's again, it's just like the Timefall, classic Kojima, where it's like he goes into detail, and there's enough there to make it feel real, that it's not fake. But at the same time, you're left puzzling about it, which is okay. He is connected to a still mother, which is a brain dead mother. So since the mother is in a state of pseudo death, and this baby still thinks that they're in the womb of that mother, that gives the baby then a connection to the afterlife, and that connection to the afterlife allows you, because you're hooked up to this baby in an artificial womb, to see the BTs, the beach things, the sort of spectral entities, and so forth. And it's one of those, it's just classic Kojima, because it makes sense to a point, but if you think about it too hard, it makes your brain explode.
That's right. Very much so.
Right? He's so good at doing that.
Yes.
And there's some really cool little touches that I noticed over time with how they try to connect BB with you. Like, I noticed, how you can sit down and like you can stretch and like rub your shoulders, and do these kind of, I don't even know if they give you a benefit, honestly. Like, sometimes BB will also do those things. Like, one time I was stretching my legs and I looked into the canister, the artificial womb, and BB was stretching, I'll go ahead and say it, her legs. Right. And I'm like, and like my response to that was, oh my gosh, that's the most adorable thing I've ever seen. Right. Like it. And actually, I'll tell you, my wife looked at that and was like, I want to have another child. And I was like, oh shit, I got to turn this game off. Right. I mean, that's how adorable BB was. That and I'll just tell you, babies are hard to do. Like, I remember I was in a drawing class, and I'm not really an artist, but I was in a drawing class because I had to be as part of my degree program, and you're taught to draw like an adult male face is like the first thing you learn to do, and you have to try to draw like thousands of them. And I remember the teacher said it's really hard to draw kids, and kind of what I took from that is it's actually really difficult to recreate kids artistically. You see that in medieval paintings, right? I mean, you see. Like in paintings from the Renaissance, you'll see like Mary there and looks like an adult woman, but then you'll see Jesus there and it's like this bizarre, like looks like a toddler, but like in the size of a baby. Like, artists just do not know how to do babies very well, typically, right? And so they must have spent a lot of time getting that character model to look right. And, there's always going to be, I think, with babies in particular, because the other thing I think that makes it hard is you can't take, like what they're able to do with Norman Reedus is they get Norman Reedus to show up, and then they scan him. He wears doodads all over his body.
Capture, yeah.
Yeah, motion capture, right? And there's now facial capture now, and there's now all kinds of technology. It's unethical to do that with actual live babies. You're not going to take someone's live baby and rig them up, and so you're kind of having to go freehand a little bit. So very respectable job, I think, artistically, of conveying that character. And the Odra deck is just a genius way to extend BB's character, because like the way it waves and taunts the BTs, when you exit a BT area, I mean, that's like the personality of the baby extending through to some mechanical piece of machinery, right?
Yeah.
So I thought they, on the whole, really hit it out of the park with BB. Something that could have been disastrous, if they had gotten that, wrong, if they hadn't done that well. So now, you listeners, that you heard me mention BB as a he, and then you heard me switch to she, and we should talk about this now. The huge reveal at the end, which was there's a bunch of reveals that happen at the end, but with BB, we find out that BB is a girl. It's Louise. Actually, is what her name is. Norman Reedus, Sam Porter Bridges, starts referring to the baby as Lou, and you just assume that's Lou as in a guy, right? And then at the very end, he says Louise, and you realize, and it's almost like a Metroid type call back in a way, right? Like, you're just not expecting that.
Yes, I never thought of it like that. Yeah, no, you're right. Yes.
And I think it's sweet because I don't quite remember this. I think maybe the baby that they were that Sam Porter Bridges was expecting to have with his wife who passed away was going to be a girl. I think maybe. I can't remember. I shouldn't quote. I shouldn't put that in stone. I'm not. That's like a stray memory that I need the research department to find out for me. But no, it was a cool little reveal, and of course you mentioned before the incineration of the baby. Let's talk about that. So, you thought it was going to happen. So why did you think that this was actually going to happen?
This is where binging it is a bit tough. But I guess I just remember at the time thinking, they talked about, I think they said something about it's past its shelf life.
Right.
You can't do anything with it anymore. It's time to burn it. So.
Yeah, and they definitely played with this notion of, in that world, allowing any human, baby or adult or otherwise, to just die normally is disastrous potentially, So I kind of I guess I just assumed that, well, yeah, I mean, if you, because, what happens at the end of the game, BB becomes sort of comatose because there's this notion that bridge babies, because of the weird aspect of, okay, there's a still mother they're connected to artificially, and it is an artificial connection, eventually they're going to get worn out, in essence, and they're going to basically be in a coma in that womb, and they're not going to be able to perform their function anymore. And I remember Deadman specifically says, hey, we don't know what'll happen necessarily if you take that baby out of the artificial womb. It could just die. And, of course, in that world, if something just dies, well, then you have to hurry up and incinerate it before it necrotizes and, causes a potential void out. So, yeah, I think there's numerous reasons. But, what ends up happening is Deadman offers Sam a way of escaping the kind of rules of that world, right? Because he's got the handcuffs on that link him up to the rest of Bridges, but also allow Bridges to essentially spy on him, which we'll talk about later, all the time. And Deadman offers him a way to kind of temporarily disable that system so that he can fiddle around, get Louise out of the artificial womb without Bridges knowing about it, because that's against the rules. Can't do that.
Yes.
Right.
Too risky. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So. He does that, and then, I'll say this, you want to talk about emotions, like, basically that's the birth of Louise there, when he gets Louise out of that artificial womb, and, what ends up happening, as is Louise gets out of there and doesn't respond, doesn't cry, which, for those of you that haven't had children, what should happen when a baby's born is they immediately cry because they're breathing. That's the sign that they're, respirating properly. And so when a baby doesn't cry, it's usually very, very bad. And so I will say this from having children and having to attend those classes and such, he does all the things that you're supposed to do, kind of the way he massages the back and so they obviously researched what you're supposed to do with an unresponsive baby. And I'll tell you that my oldest daughter was born not breathing, and that made me think of that, and that was a hit. That was a hit to the feels. That was a hit.
I'll bet it was, yeah.
Right in the feels. Fortunately, just like it was in the case of with my daughter, Louise does come around. Fortunately, and that and it's like, look, it's sort of like, I think you're right. I think the game world does enough job, a good enough job, kind of making you think, oh my gosh, it's just so dangerous for these bridge babies to die, that you do actually think it's a possibility that you have to just incinerate the child, right? And so you're genuinely surprised when that doesn't happen. It's a pleasant, nice surprise, obviously, right? And it's a neat moment. I actually really like then how the subsequent loading screens show Sam and Louise, walking out of the facility. That's kind of neat. Little post-game thing. But anyway, wow, yeah. We can talk about BB a long, long time. Let's move on to some other characters. Sam. So the cover boy of the game, Sam Porter Bridges, So first of all, I guess we'll, obviously Norman Reedus, huge, massive star. We both like The Walking Dead, right? So we both
Yes.
know about Norman Reedus. So just, I guess, Chris, I've been going on and on. What are your thoughts about just Norman Reedus as an actor and this character, Sam Porter Bridges?
You know, he seems great. Does a good job. At first, I was like, oh, "This is Daryl," but
Right? Where's the
very shortly
crossbow?
after, I could see the difference. He talked. Daryl just grunts a lot and
Right.
says "piss off," whatever. Whereas
You're right.
Sam talks a little bit more. So I was able to see him as Sam very quickly. I guess you definitely get your money's worth with the Norman Reedus star factor throughout the story, but once it's over, you don't really like when you start going after that trophy hunting. It could be anyone after that. Like you really don't get a lot of that anymore. So
Right.
definitely great for the story, um, but after that, could be anybody. So
Well, and I think you made an excellent point about it. It could be anybody because the thing that I got out of Sam's character, and it's tricky. I think Norman Reedus was given a harder job than people realize. Like when you're a player character, especially the way I think Kojima has structured his player characters, going back to at least Snake Eater, is that he really says, okay, look, the player character is not just a fictional character. Like it's not the approach Naughty Dog takes, where it's like, uh, the main character of Uncharted, Nathan Drake, that is a fully realized person, and you're supposed to just sort of, yes, you're controlling him, but it is a distinct person. It's not you. At least that's what I assume they do, because that's what it feels like. With Kojima's games, and definitely with Sam is you. Like
yes,
even Hartman even refers like to the player at times. Like some of his messages, I think his emails or whatever, interviews, what have you, talk about Homo Ludens, which is the mascot of Kojima Productions, but it's really representing the player. He's like, well, Sam, you're a Homo Ludens, those who play, and that's why you're the right person for the job. And
mm-hmm.
so, that's sort of like that character saying you, the player, are the right person for the job. And
Mm-hmm.
and like the way the fourth wall is constantly broken with Sam in the hideouts or the private rooms. So, the character has to be a cipher. It has to be a character that, if the character shows too much sort of dynamic emotion, you can't put yourself in it very well, right? If the character's too defined. So you have to be kind of in neutral in a way. And so I think kind of Norman Reedus's kind of understated manner that he usually portrays most roles with is appropriate for this. I think it
Right.
works well for that. I
Yep.
do agree with you though, and it is a little different than Daryl. He is a little bit more verbose. He's a little less of a here's a fascinating thing. I didn't put this in my notes, but it just occurred to me now. This is not at all the typical video game action game player character. He is not a fighter. I mean, he will fight if he has to, but he is not like a trained soldier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously he can like shoot a gun and throw a punch, but he's not elite. He is just the only thing particularly special about him is the fact he has dooms,
Yes.
right, and the fact that he has the power to repatriate. So that's basically respawning made into baked into the story. So he has that, but otherwise, I mean, he is just a delivery guy. I mean, someone did a hilarious video of like I think I sent this to you, the evolution of CQC, close quarters combat,
Yes.
where it
Yes.
showed like the animations of like Solid Snake from MGS1 all
Yeah.
the way up to Big Boss, and then it shows Sam flailing about idiotically,
Yeah.
when he punches and kicks. And yeah, he is not, Big Boss would easily defeat Sam. I mean,
Oh, totally. And that's very evident when, say, you've got 10 mules after you.
right.
And I remember doing that. And I'm just like, man, this guy can't aim. He can't do this. And I'm used to playing Metal Gear Solid 5, right? And I'm like, this is a lot, again, like a lot like Silent Hill 2, where James Sunderland, he's an average guy. He's not an athlete. If he runs for a while, he's going to start gasping and weaving, and he's got to take a break. And Sam, I mean, he does a lot of walking and all that, but he's not Snake. He's
Right.
not, he doesn't have superpowers, and if he falls off a cliff, he dies, and he can only carry so much cargo.
Right. Yep.
And he's not a warrior. He is a delivery guy first. Absolutely.
And that's cool. I like that. I actually really do enjoy, that aspect of you are playing the everyman. It could be you or I, like there's really
Mm-hmm.
nothing that he does other than the Doom stuff, that we couldn't also do,
Mm-hmm.
if provided the equipment and support he's provided. And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of neat. It's kind of a neat thing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's time to now naturally segue to a character that is really cool because at first there seems to be utterly no connection at all. Even though as when I watched the cutscenes again today, I'm like, oh yeah, it's right there. That's, by the way, one of the signs it's such a great story is you go back and you see, oh, there's all kinds of hints. I just didn't
Yes,
see them,
that's right.
and that's of course Cliff. That's Mads Mikkelsen's character. He won a boatload of awards actually for portraying this character in Death Stranding, and I think they're well deserved. It is a spectacular performance, as this guy that is you see him as a loving father, loving husband. He's there. You can tell pretty easily it's a Bridges facility. You can tell that, okay, yeah, he's got a wife that had something happen and she's brain dead now, and that's his child. That he's talking to, and you see all these memories every time Sam plugs into BB. Or at least, if not every time, many times when he does, you're given one of these memory scenes, and where you see this poor guy just trying to, interact with his child and getting angry at Bridges' staff for, essentially misleading him. Except at the beginning you don't know why, but you're wondering what does this have to do with Sam, and you assume. And the game kind of intentionally tricks you in this way that is BB's memories, but you're like, that doesn't make sense because this was clearly a number of years before. And yet BB, I know with Bridge babies, aging probably works a little differently, or it's probably not exactly the same as like an actual baby. But it's still, I think, I don't think BB is 10 years old or something, or 20 or 30 years old. I think BB is still probably, relatively, maybe BB's a year old. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
right? But still, like, that doesn't make sense. How can these be BB's or Lou or Louise's memories? Because, that was like, long ago, the stuff that you're seeing these memories of. But you don't think about it too hard because, you think, well, okay, Sam is just getting these memories from the BB program. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. Like, okay, these are just memories that all BBs have because they're in this same research program and it kind of all gets put in the soup. I guess that's kind of how I thought of it. It
Mm-hmm.
never occurred to me until late in the game that those are Sam's memories and that
Mm-hmm.
Sam is the baby. That was an amazing revelation.
Yes.
One of the coolest I've had in a game. And like, because here's the thing, like, let me just ask you, like, you're before the back half of the game when things started to get revealed. So, like, the first time you encounter Cliff in the war zone and all that, like, what did you think that character was? Villain or what?
I knew he was a tortured soul trying to get his child back.
Right,
And I think he was trying, I thought of him as trying to get his child back from Sam. And he saw Sam as the enemy.
right,
And he was trying to get his BB back.
right.
That's how I saw him.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much exactly how I saw him too. It's sort of like a enemy that you're meant to empathize with, which of course, actually, when you think about it, is 100% what Kojima always does with all the bosses in Metal Gear. There's always this long exposition of, sometimes like comically so, right? I think MGS4 is probably the worst one in this regard, where like you defeat one of the bosses and then Drebin will then contact you on the codec to go on for like an hour about why you should feel bad about their life, right? So there's a little bit of that, just a little bit of that feeling. But then as the game progresses, you realize there's more to it than that. You realize that actually Cliff, and it's Cliff Unger is his full name, he's connected not just to Sam, but he's connected to Amelie, who we haven't talked about yet. Amelie / Bridget, spoiler, they're the same person.
Mm-hmm.
That, by the way, I'll just, as a quick aside, even though we're not talking about those characters yet, that I saw right away. Like, the fact that Amelie and Bridget were the same person seemed to be pretty clear to me, but we'll shelve that discussion for later. With Cliff, it just kind of gradually builds. But the one thing I wanted to bring up, because I remember this when I played, and then I looked for it specifically when I was going back through the cutscenes today. Those fights, not the actual ones that you have where you're shooting him or whatever. I remember you're not actually, I believe, Chris Miller, a huge fan of those sequences.
The army ones?
Right, yeah.
I kept getting lost. I don't know if I was just tired or what, but from my binging. But the first one, I distinctly remember. I remember scaling the whole level, and I just kept getting lost. So those weren't my favorites parts of the game for sure.
Right, but what I do remember is when you get to the end of those sequences and you defeat Cliff, he's kind of just sitting there on the ground or laying on the ground. You walk up to him, and then there's like a little brief canned fight. And of course, just as an aside, I thought there'd be a QTE, and thank goodness there was not one. It's always such a cliche thing. There's a little bit of a tussle, but then, and I thought this was weird the first time I saw it, you embrace kind of accidentally, because you're wrestling with one another, but you do embrace, and it looks like an embrace, and then it ends. Then you're back in the normal world, and it's kind of like Cliff's soul is put to rest briefly by this, and you're left wondering, what the heck just happened here?
Yeah.
And then you end up realizing as the game moves on is you're related to Cliff, and then you're like, oh yeah, actually that's your father. And he is a lost soul. He is unaware because he's driven mad with rage at his situation.
Yes.
And by the way, 100. What you learned about Cliff is he's like, morally justified to feel the way he does. Like, there's really nothing evil about this character whatsoever. Like,
yes.
Like, you're just like, oh, of course, because Bridget lies to him. He's going to use Sam to freaking build bridges on, which means that's going to be a child sacrifice, basically, which is a plot reveal late in the game that, like, for the chiral network to function, a bridge baby has to die, basically. It serves as a network key. I don't know if you remember this, Chris, but in Edge Knot City, you're given a dead baby and that's the network key that causes the whole network to function. And Sam even looks at it, kind of half realizing what's going on. It's just like, what in the world, right?
Right.
And so, like, you were going to be used basically as a sacrifice. Cliff learns this and rebels, and tries to save, the player character's life, basically. And then because of the way, Cliff has no way to know that Amelie makes the decision to resurrect Sam's character. He has no way to know this. He thinks that not only does he think his baby's dead, but that in the way the afterlife and the metaphysical aspects of this game is handled, you die, you go to the beach, and then you walk to the beach to go to wherever, that game's sort of, metaphysics say that you go. It would have been Sam the baby and Cliff going together in the afterlife. But because Amelie feels bad and resurrects Sam, it's just Cliff, and it just shows Cliff standing there and then moving on. And so, like, Cliff moves on, but is missing the baby, and he doesn't realize the baby's been resurrected. And I think there's also this element of, like, I think Amelie on purpose, to reunite them. I think she does comment that she, sort of sent. Oh, that's right. She gives Cliff those fake babies. Ah, yes. The fake babies. I'm sure you remember that even, well, I think you watched just the first trailer, but like some of the subsequent trailers, it showed Cliff with these fake, baby doll things.
Oh, they're floating down the sewer, right?
Right. Those are devices that Amelie, as this sort of angel of death character, gives not just Cliff, but he also gives one to Die Hardman to connect them to her beach, to basically let them kind of, use a little bit of her power, I guess.
Now, isn't one of those in Higgs's?
That's correct. Yeah, she gives one to Higgs too. Yeah. That's kind of how she confers power to people that aren't her.
Right.
Yeah, boy, we're really deep in it now, man. It's great. But yeah, no, Cliff is completely justified to try to do this. He just doesn't realize at first Sam is who he is, and then you get to the Vietnam thing. Now, did you notice, Chris, the lullaby theme, right? That he whistles to the baby in the memories.
Yes.
Right, and that's like actually it's the main theme song of the game. And what happens, I didn't notice this until I watched today. That last scene in Vietnam, there's something that happens that makes Cliff realize that the adult Sam is his child. And, because he's sitting there and, he starts to take BB. Sam pulls BB back. But even then, it's not as confrontational as the previous two. He's not trying to fight. He starts to whistle the lullaby to the baby, but he stops, and then Sam completes it. I didn't catch that the first time. Like, that Sam somehow remembers that lullaby from being, the actual BB in the jar.
Right.
And so he's able to complete the theme, and then it was from that then all of a sudden Cliff is given awareness. And he's like, they told me you're Sam Porter Bridges, he says.
Yeah.
And let me just tell you, I'll ask, that was so powerful, man. Was that powerful for you? Because I thought that was a really powerful thing that they connected those characters that way.
Oh, definitely. And, in most shows or games or whatever, I can usually predict what's going to happen. And in this game, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, no, I didn't either. And it was just really cool to see like this arc of, yep, this is a villain, maybe a tortured soul, maybe we're meant to sympathize, but still a villain, go all the way around to like what Sam says to Die Hardman after, I think he says it to Deadman when he comes back. He goes, he just wanted to talk. Like, like his whole reason, like he didn't actually, really want to harm anyone, even though he does kind of take those people hostage on the beach later and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But, really cool performance, really kind of what I like about it. And then we'll kind of move on. We'll try to lightning round some of these other characters, but like it gives the game, because the game deals with such massive themes of like extinction and end of the world and apocalyptic stuff, but yet it has this beating heart of a father-son reuniting, which is just a very human, very kind of small, but very, sort of warm kind of center to this pretty outlandish sci-fi big story. And it works really well. Really does.
Yep.
All right, so we're just going to hit some of these real quick here. So obviously we have Deadman and we have Fragile. Kind of group these together. I looked at Deadman as the comic relief character. It's Guillermo del Toro's body, but it's another voice actor actually doing the voice. What did you think of that shower scene, if you remember that, Chris?
I laughed.
Yes. He's such a goofball. Like, he appears in the shower.
It was a very clever way. Again, I didn't see it coming. And he,
right.
Sam's like, what the hell are you doing? But he had to get him alone, right? To give him that information. I forget what it was, but he had to get him alone. And that was the only way to do it. So
Right. Yes. And, I'll just mention he appears to be the conscience of the game because he's the first, maybe in a lot of ways, only character to actually express like, hey, maybe Bridges does weird crap that's like not so great. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's because he's in the dark and he actually helps you research this. Like, because trying to build this chiral network by basically murdering a child is not nice.
No.
Right. So Fragile, I guess she's Cajun. I guess that's how they can justify a French accented woman in America. Right. I mean, not that there's not people with accents in America, obviously, but like it is a curious choice. And I guess, from that perspective, it sort of makes sense. I think it was a good character, though. We talked before in the last podcast, because it wasn't a spoiler to do this, just the nice wordplay. She's actually literally fragile, because of her exposure to the timefall.
Yes. I really thought that was clever. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but I said this in the first podcast, but again, Quiet in Metal Gear Solid 5 was virtually naked, but there was a reason for that. It's not because people are perverts. there was an actual storyline behind it, and it made sense. It wasn't an afterthought. And the same reason here, Fragile is virtually completely covered up because she's been shriveled to a prune by Timefall.
Right, right. And that's really, something that, because obviously, I think the intent, you could have gotten any number of people to play this role, but you get an incredibly beautiful French woman in Léa Seydoux to play this because it's meant to be, I think, more tragic, right? Mm-hmm. This is yes. a beautiful young woman that is basically like her life is thrown away because you have to assume the Timefall infects you internally too, right? That it's not just your skin wrinkling, right? So basically she is a 80-year-old woman with mm-hmm. a 25-year-old head, mm-hmm. In effect, or however old she actually is.
And her rage at Higgs is very powerful, and it's a driving force throughout the storyline.
She says something that I think is really cool because it is not just a cool bit of dialogue, but I think it also reveals Kojima's hopes for how he would like his story to affect the culture. And I think it's actually a positive thing. She says to Sam, we don't have to be, I'm going to mangle this quote, but it's something like, we don't have to be, I think it's something like we don't have to be on the same side to want the same things, or maybe it's the opposite of that. We don't have to, want the same things to be on the same side. I'm research department's taking a nap, so I won't learn exactly what that quote is, but I took it to mean, hey, look, we're gonna have disagreements in society. Like Quiet is not, she does become a member of Bridges at the end, but she's not a member of Bridges, during the story. She has her own agenda. That agenda is revenge against Higgs, but that doesn't mean that she can't have a positive relationship with Sam as he's achieving his goals. They could work together, right? Which you can really hear what Kojima is trying to say there to America, mm-hmm. right? Like, hey, you guys disagree and are really polarized. That doesn't mean you can't work together. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's a deep truth to that that's kind of interesting. And
absolutely.
It's certainly not a negative thing to point out in any event.
No, not at all.
Right. So Die Hardman and Hartman, talk about those characters. So, I feel like with Die Hardman, that's your Colonel character, right? Like from the Metal Gears. That's that voice that's commanding you, but you have to be likable. And I think it was a reasonably solid job. I think it wasn't. There was nothing wrong with the performance. He's the one character, I think, though, that upon reflection, like the game's motif of crying, which, yes, I get it. It's the chiral allergy most of the time that's causing it in the game. Like, his emotions maybe was the closest thing to, silliness in this game. And in a game that really lacked that and didn't really have a lot of cringe in it. Like, I did cringe just slightly at the kind of like, oh, I love Cliff as a commander so much because, that he was underneath Cliff, in his army unit. But I really adore Bridget and I have to make this hard choice. There's just a little tiny bit of cringe there, but it was mostly effective as the Colonel character that's giving you your orders as you play, I guess. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Die Hardman.
Just that last scene, I think, before just near the ending where he just breaks down in tears there. I thought that was really out of character for him. Given that he was the Colonel type character throughout the game, and it always started with Sam, and then he'd start talking, right? And then for him to have that meltdown at the end, I was really, really cringing there. I thought that was really out of character for him.
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent point. Now, actually, that's probably what I was feeling was that it didn't, a story, and look, now I'm going to nitpick a game that's 50, 60, 70 hours long or whatever, but a story has to earn moments like that. And I feel like with Cliff, it earned his emotions. I feel like Sam earned his emotions. I think pretty much all the other characters in the game more or less earned their emotions, but he kind of didn't, because we didn't really get a sense of an emotional person. We really did get a sense of, I am going to do what I think is necessary, and to heck with the consequences, don't care. And even you find out that he lies to Sam. Like, he and Amelie kind of engineer this lie where they're like, Amelie is trapped in Edge Knot and can't get out, and that's what causes Sam, who is dead set against helping Bridges, to want to help Bridges. And you find out that's actually a lie, and it was Die Hardman's idea.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a guy that is more than willing to play it fast and loose, to do what he thinks is right. So him feeling all broken up about, look, like, he tried to help Cliff break out of the facility. It didn't go well, and, he had a duty to do because his president said you got to shoot him. It's hard. I don't know. I sort of felt like that's a character that can pull the trigger, that doesn't need the president to make him do it, physically actually make him do it.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's, there's just not enough there to earn it. But let's move on to Hartman. Hartman is the sort of, well, he's the researcher, right? I don't have a lot to say. He was sort of mildly comical.
Yes.
There was no cringe. Didn't hate the character. Thought he was pretty well acted. I don't know with your thoughts on Hartman.
No, I agree. Definitely a little bit of comic relief. That British dry humor.
Right.
And as we discussed before, we'd love to have a pad like his up in the mountains.
Oh, right. I'm glad you mentioned that. He's got the swankiest post-apocalyptic digs that I think I've ever seen.
I agree, yes.
I mean, that's definitely like one of those like Better Homes and Gardens, with the cool wood paneling and the fire and all that. They really decked him out nicely. One note I had on Hartman that I actually do think is cool is that, like, when you think about scientists in the popular culture now, they tend to be like almost like authoritarian figures, like science with a capital S. That's it. That's, materialism, the stuff that's around you. That's all there is. Science, 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 right? Hartman is not that way at all. He acknowledges the metaphysical. Now, yes, I get that in this world, the metaphysical has been proven somewhat, so that obviously it would be really stupid to be purely a materialist in the Death Stranding world, where like an actual afterlife has been empirically accessed. But nonetheless, it's an interesting archetype. It's kind of the way, when you think about scientists as they were portrayed in fiction before the 20th century, you think of someone like Van Helsing, who was a scientist, was a researcher, but also was like, understood the religious rites of his day and operated kind of within those confines. I always really liked Van Helsing as like this science and almost priest combined, and Hartman kind of harkens to that just a little bit, which I liked.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on we're going to try again, because we can just go on and on here. I'm going to wrap up multiple characters at once. So we'll talk about Mama. We'll talk about let's just talk about Mama real quick. So I thought that she was the James Bond Q, right? Every time you get new gear, she's going to tell you about it. And I actually thought it was a really good performance, because that's kind of a boring job, and she was kind of mildly witty and sarcastic. Any thoughts on that character?
She kind of reminded me of a Sheldon Cooper kind of character, kind of awkward, straight to the point, awkward. Also, when her and her sister merged, how the sister and her had different eye colors, and then when they merged, one had one eye color and one had the other. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, that's an interesting little side story that happens between them, and how each of them, I think how it's set up is like the one, like they each can't have a baby on their own, because they each have one part of that system that, like, I forget how it is, like the one doesn't have the uterus that works right, and the other, but they're able to they try to kind of combine forces to have a baby, because like the one, I think it's Lockney has, she marries a guy, and then the guy dies, and then all this stuff happens, and then that's how she has this baby. But the baby actually was born on the other side. The baby was born on the beach, which means she's not actually alive. She is truly dead and hiding it, but being kept alive just because of this connection to the baby or whatever. So it's kind of another brain buster. I mean, it's just sort of like, how does this work? And right. All right, so let's talk a bit, and we'll yeah, we'll actually talk a little bit about Higgs, because I'm gonna kind of, because we're running really long on time and there's still a whole other section I wanted to get to. We'll briefly talk about Higgs and talk about Amelie to close out the character portion. So Higgs, to me, the comment I'll make is that this game doesn't have a lot of archetypical characters, which is a positive thing. He's maybe one of the closest archetypical character the game has, in terms of like, I'm a villain driven mad by power in the pursuit of power. But I think he does have a little bit of depth, because when you learn about him through the logs or whatever, you find out this was like an abused kid, right? And it kind of warped him. And then you read in his emails or diaries or whatever they are that he kind of, when his I think abusive father dies, or brother, I can't remember now if it's his big brother that abuses him or whatever, but like he realizes that he gets a little bit of Doom's power every time someone dies, and that turns him into a murderer because he keeps murdering people to increase his Doom's power. I believe that's the story anyway. So any thoughts on Higgs?
Well, when he first showed up and I saw him as it's Troy Baker, right?
Yeah, Troy Baker.
Yeah, Troy Baker. I was so used to him as Ocelot. I know he's been in a lot of other games, but I've only seen him in Metal Gear Solid 5. So when he first came up, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to separate these two, because I'm so used to him playing Ocelot. But within 5 minutes, he was Higgs, and he's probably my favorite character in the whole game. I really liked his performance, really good performance. He kind of reminded me of M. Bison from the Street Fighter animated movie, where it just has all these all-powerful powers, and he can just appear and disappear at will, and very climatic. And I really, really thought he was a great character. I wish we would have seen more of him, actually.
I think I agree in retrospect, because one of the things that makes Higgs unique is that, this game, and actually I know some people that really didn't like Death Stranding because of this, it is not like Metal Gear, where all the characters are outlandish and just like larger than life. It's actually all the characters are understated in this game compared to Kojima's other work anyway.
Yeah.
Troy Baker's Higgs is the one character that really does chew up real estate on the screen. Like, he's the one character that really goes for that bravura, I'm a villain thing.
Totally, yeah.
And he's great at it,
Yes.
And Troy Baker commented that when Kojima cast him, he casted Troy Baker as Troy Baker. Like, it is him being him, to some extent. And so he really allowed him to do what he's best at doing. And I think that definitely comes through in the character.
Yeah.
All right, so finally, the last character we'll talk about in this part of our podcast here is Amelie / Bridget, who is the same person. And of course, this character was played, at least the elderly version and middle-aged version, was played by Lindsay Wagner from The Bionic Woman, which is really interesting, because this is an actress that was really famous back in the day and kind of got into that comfortable Hallmark movie cycle. Like, my parents have probably watched a lot of her work on the Hallmark channel, right? And now here's a world-famous video game creator who happens to really like her, plucks her out of obscurity to be in one of the biggest games of the year. I think it's kind of a delightful story.
Absolutely.
And it's just interesting, because this is the character, if Cliff you think is a villain and you realize is not, Amelie / Bridget is a character that you think is good and then not so fast. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Right? And she really is. I think Higgs calls her this, and he's exactly right. She is an angel of death. That's what she is. Her whole role as the extinction entity is to bring about the end of the world. That is, she is the angel that in the whole in the Old Testament times swept through Egypt and took the firstborn unless you had the blood on the door. Like, this is who this character is. Really terrifying character, right? But also, what's kind of interesting is she kind of seems to regret her job and wants to kind of do things to interfere with that, right? But then seems to forget this when she interacts with Higgs and seems like, yeah, I'm going to kill everything. And you're left with, you just don't know what she's going to do, and let's talk quickly about the ending, where you're presented with a conundrum, right? You're on Amelie's beach, and you have a gun. She says, you know what to do. Sam says, I don't know what to do. She says, yeah, you do. And she starts walking towards her, she starts walking into the ocean on her beach. And you know that if she gets too far, it's the end of the world. It's the end of all things, right? What you're supposed to do, because the game teaches this, the game combat is never really the primary solution to anything. What you're supposed to do is put the gun away, holster the gun, and then you get the choice to hug her, and then that's the resolution. I thought that was just an amazing... You want to talk about a game earning that? We make fun of things like press F for respects in Call of Duty or whatever. This, I think Death Stranding earns this, right? Not telling you what to do, having you do this, press button to hug, all that. I think the game earned it. What did you think?
Oh, in that scene, I unloaded on her. I think, for some reason, I can't remember. I think you only had 6 shots, and I unloaded all 6 shots on her, and then it didn't work. So I'm like, okay, go up and hug her, I guess. And then when Sam puts the gun to his head, and pulls the trigger, and then the game ends briefly. I'm thinking, now if I go back and I don't unload on her, and then Sam puts the gun to his head and pulls the trigger, is that really the end of the game? Like, did I do the right thing by unloading on her? And I never did go back and try and see what happens.
Right.
But
I don't think I did either. I think the gun is purely a MacGuffin. I think they really don't care. Like what happened with me, and not to make myself sound like some kind of genius, I also did that. I also tried. I kind of knew it was the wrong thing to do, but since they don't give you any prompts or anything, that's why I talk about it earning this moment, right? It intentionally does not do things that are usual good game design, right? It tells you nothing. It leaves you to your own devices. You really do have to figure out from trial and error, which I'm fine with because I think it earns this. But like I did try to shoot and actually had the end of the world happen a few times, and you respawn and get to try again, and then finally I'm like, oh, okay. Because I would walk up to her and get no prompt because I had the gun out. And I had to put the gun away before I got the prompt to hug or whatever. So, holy cow. We're going to take one quick break, and then we're going to kind of wrap it up with our final thoughts, even though I think we can go much, much longer. My wife is going to probably put my head on a stake if this is a 3-hour podcast. So we're going to take another break and come right back to wrap it up. Death Stranding Spoiler Podcast. All right, welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. This is going to be our final segment. We're going to try to wrap up. In my notes, I have 2 segments here that we'll try to roll into one, which is fine, because I think we ended up kind of inadvertently talking about the story as we've gone anyway. But just to kind of, tie that up, I personally believe that this is the best Hideo Kojima story he's done, with maybe the exception of Snatcher, because that's so well-renowned. Now, I'm going to make a confession. I haven't gotten all the way to the end of Snatcher, so you're a better judge than I am on this. Like, do you think this is Kojima's best story?
It's certainly his most original, I would say. I don't know about best, and it's hard to say because I've only played, I guess, 4 of his games, which would be Snatcher, Metal Gear Solid 1, Metal Gear Solid 5, and this. So it's definitely one of his best for sure. It's very original, it's deep, and you can't predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think the thing that I really like about it, when you talk about being original, is that he's had a crutch in that when you look at what Metal Gear is, as cool as Metal Gear is, he's riffing off of things.
Yes.
Like, he's riffing off of Escape from New York. He's riffing off of all kinds of source material. And look, all creators do that, but Metal Gear is a pastiche, I think. And that's fairly obvious. Even Snatcher is a little bit of that because he's riffing off of William Gibson and Cyberpunk and all this.
Yes.
With Death Stranding, he's really given the opportunity, maybe for the first time in his career, to not be tethered to anything. Thank you, Sony, for that. And allowing him to make something from scratch. Not that there isn't influences. Of course there's influences. But this is really a truly original work. And I think there was a feeling that, well, maybe if he's doing something original, he's going to fall on his face. And instead, I think he created one of his finest stories. We can argue all day long about whether or not it's the best, one of his better games. That's like another discussion, in my opinion. But as a story, I think it is what I told you in our pre-show chat. I think it's a good story no matter how you slice it. And I think it's a great video game story, which is, relatively rare. Happens more often than I think some people would want to give credit for, but it is still pretty rare. I think it's an amazing achievement. And, one last thing that I'll bring up here is, Kojima likes to make comments on society in his games a little bit, and this is not a political podcast. We're not going to go there. But we'll just briefly mention, he is making this comment about connection. And, this notion of, hey, when you are living in a country, it's good to be connected to one another. It's good to, have, it's good to like converse. It's good to commune with people. It's good to have, it is not good to be isolated and opposed. And this is something that he says in all of his interviews that he is not trying to advocate connection or not, but it does seem clear to me that that's probably his personal opinion, that like we should be connected and that we should be helping each other and social in that way, which I will say does rub up against kind of what I would call certain components of American culture. And it is a fascinating juxtaposition because when you think of, okay, like the Red Dead Redemption games, right, which are made to be American Westerns. What are those games about? Virtually the opposite. It is about, I'm an American, I'm going to go to the frontier, and I'm going to live on my own. I don't need the government, don't need anything to help me. I can live on my own and make my own way. And the message in Death Stranding is, not so fast. We need to help each other. No one can live on their own. I just think, regardless of whether or not you feel what you agree with or not, that's a really fascinating cultural statement from Kojima, I think. All right, so any final thoughts, Chris Millar, on Death Stranding, just anything about the game at all?
Again, a very addictive storyline that I couldn't predict. I found the game addictive but frustrating at the same time. Ended up putting 196 hours in, and I don't regret it at all. Time well spent, even though I was gnashing my teeth at times when I was climbing up those snowy mountains before I built the zipline network. Again, like I said in the first podcast, a lot of Silent Hill influences on this, from the BTs that drag you down to fighting the creatures in like a kind of the other world or the dark world. And I don't know if this is intentional or not, but you'll notice the name of Sam's mother is Lisa.
Ah, yes.
And another, nod to PT. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. I thought the mules were underutilized. Like when you fight them, they're really clumsy, silly NPCs at the end of the day.
Right.
They're predictable. It would have been nice to talk, maybe a little more expansion on that area.
Right.
They're more of a nuisance more than anything. I like driving. I like hitting them with a vehicle. It's very satisfying, and you don't kill them either. When you see blood flying, and the whole, you get that slowdown effect for a sec, but it doesn't kill them. It just knocks them out.
Right.
This is going to be a controversial comment, but
all right.
I think this game could have used some microtransactions.
Oh boy. Yeah. You're not kidding.
Yeah. Like when you look at Metal Gear Solid 5, you didn't need to use any of the microtransactions. They were optional, right? To get the insurance on your base or to make your base build quicker. It was completely optional. And I think this could have had that too, to say, say you pay 99 cents and you got a whole whack of chiral crystals or chemicals put into your private locker. Or some sort of a chiral shower that blanketed the world that would renew all your zip lines and everything that's deteriorating. Because I guess there is definitely, for me, an element of anxiety there, where I think things deteriorate in the world too fast, and it's really difficult to keep up with maintaining. There's already so many maintenance tasks in the game, and it's extremely difficult to maintain that stuff. So I would have gladly paid 99 cents to get some chemicals so I could upgrade my zip lines to level 3 quicker, or some sort of a chiral shower that went over the countryside or something that renewed all the zip lines at once. So while most people are very much against microtransactions, when I think about, again, the limited time that you and I as family men have in real life, I would have gladly paid 99 cents to have those things happen a little quicker in the game so I could save time in real life. For me, that is worth the money.
Right. So, Hideo Kojima, you have left money on the table, sir. And remember that, for next time. So, holy cow, folks, this might be a Grid Snaps podcast record. Well done, Chris. I really appreciate you spending all this time with me talking about this game. It's really awesome that, that you're willing to do that. So thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the game, and it was great to talk to you about this throughout the whole time. We've been chatting back and forth, and it's good to have someone that's as into the game as I was, and we could trade tips back and forth, because there's just so much depth to it.
Right. Yes.
Had certain questions, and all I can say is if even though I've done the trophies, within 2 months of the game coming out, I don't know if there's going to be any DLC for it, but if there isn't, my suggestion to you or anyone that's listening is just keep picking away at it for the next few years. Even there's that much depth and replayability to it that you can keep going, and some of the surprises and things that pop up, I think it's worth the time. So I say to you, Rob, keep playing it. Just even if it's little chunks at a time. There's no one's got a gun to your head, and you can play it for years, right? So,
absolutely.
If you've got the time, I think it's worth 5-starring everyone and keep going, and you'll get some of those payoffs for sure.
All right, everyone. So thank you so much for listening, and stay on the grid and keep well hid. Hey everyone, Rob here. Hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. I just wanted to take a moment to remind you of the easiest ways to support what Kip and I are doing. The easiest way to support us is by subscribing on iTunes, Google Play, or Podbean and leaving a positive review there. You can find us on iTunes and Google Play by searching for the Grid Snaps podcast. You can find us on Podbean simply by going to rohogames.podbean.com. This simple show of support helps us show up higher in searches and will bring our podcast to more people.